Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Work Foundation event looking at how insecure work plays out across England and the extent to which tackling insecure work could help us reduce regional inequalities. My name's Ben Harrison. I'm the director here at the Work Foundation. We're a policy think tank which is part of Lancaster University, and we're committed to supporting everyone to access well-paid, secure employment. And our current work programme is particularly focused on job insecurity for those who face structural disadvantage within the labour market and the interrelationship between health and work as well. Over the course of the last 3 years, we've spent quite a lot of time and produced quite a range of research aimed at understanding more about how insecure work manifests itself in the UK in the 21st century. Our UK Insecure Work Index provided a new measure of insecurity, taking into account not just things like 0 hours contracts, but also levels of pay and access to key employment rights. And what it revealed is that there are over 6.5 million people in the UK today working in severely insecure employment. And that has all kinds of impacts and implications for them, for the places that they live and the labour market more broadly. We've been able to dig down further to understand the worker groups who are most at risk of experiencing job insecurity. And in particular, that includes women, those from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, those with disabilities, and young people, as well as some of the sectors like retail and hospitality, where this work is often primarily concentrated. But our aim for today is to explore how these factors are playing out across England and really to get under the skin of the question, to what extent does where you live have a big impact on your chances of ending up in severely insecure work? And alongside that, what can we do at the level of place to try and tackle some of the job insecurity that we see across the country? To help us to do this, Work Foundation Principal Analyst Rebecca Florisson is going to shortly give an overview of our work looking at labour market insecurity across English combined authorities. And then I'm delighted to also be joined by an expert panel who will be offering their reflections as we go through the conversation this afternoon. In particular, Andrea Barry, who's Principal Economist at the Youth Futures Foundation, Paul Swinney, Director of Research and Policy at Centre for Cities, and Fiona Aldridge, Head of Insight on Economic Delivery, Skills and Enterprise at West Midlands Combined Authority. Before I hand over to Rebecca, who will take you through our analysis and the headline data, I just want to say that we will be recording the session today. And if you want to ask a question of anybody who's speaking today during the session, then please do use the Q&A function in Zoom, not the chat, the Q&A function. And I'll be monitoring that through the conversation. I'll do my best to make sure we get through some of those in the course of the conversation. For now, though, I'll hand over to you, Rebecca, and then we'll open up the conversation after we've heard from you.
Thanks very much for that, Ben. I'm just going to start that. Unless I hear anything to the contrary, I'm going to assume that the slides are working properly. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Rebecca Florisson, and as Ben has been saying, we've been doing a lot of work around insecurity over the past few years. And one of the really interesting kind of puzzles that we came across was that we'd initially thought that we might see quite a bit of regional variation in that extent to which people experience insecurity. But we saw a lot less of a difference between North and South or between the different regions than we were expecting. And that was really because insecurity plays out at a much more local level. So we've set out to look at differences in the extent to which people experience insecurity across the different mayoral combined authorities in England. And really, we've set out to identify kind of what the drivers are for seeing the differences that we are seeing. In addition to our paper, Delivering Levelling Up, we have also taken deeper dives into the city regions. There was just not enough space in the report itself to do justice to all of it. So we have published 9 city region employment profiles for the mayoral combined authorities. We've also published a profile for Greater London and 2 profiles for future mayoral combined authorities, so East Midlands and the North East. So they look in greater detail at sort of the wider context of those labour markets. So employment, unemployment, levels of security, all down to the local authority level. Some of you will be very familiar by now with the way that the Work Foundation understands and measures insecure work, but just as a bit of a recap for those who are less familiar with it, we look at insecurity in the labour market through the lens of 3 different ways in which people can experience precarity. The first of which is contractual insecurity. So that's where people are not guaranteed future hours or future work. Then we have financial insecurity, where people might be on unpredictable pay or their pay is simply too low to get by, and a lack of access to worker rights and protections, either by virtue of employment status or because people haven't worked for their employer for a given amount of time yet, and so they're missing out on a specific sort of rights and entitlements. Now, it's really important to emphasize that none of these forms of work indicate bad work per se. It's just that we know that for many people, multiple forms of insecurity come together, and that can really negatively impact people's finances, their physical and mental well-being, and their future employment prospects and outcomes. So we have mapped these indicators in the Labour Force Survey and brought them together into an index. So that gives us nearly half of workers in the UK and England currently are in secure work, which means they have none of the indicators of insecurity. But the group of workers that we're focusing on particularly is that nearly 20% of workers, so 1 in 5 workers who are in severely insecure work. For us, that means that they are they experience involuntary part-time or involuntary temporary work, meaning that they are in part-time or temporary work, but they really want to be working full-time or in a permanent job, or they experience multiple forms of insecurity coming together. So let's keep the 19.8% in mind when we go on to the next slide, where we're looking at the difference in the average level of insecurity for each of the mayoral combined authorities and Greater London. So we're seeing here that that baseline of the 0%, that basically indicates the average, so the 19.8% of people who are in insecure work. And then we see in places like Liverpool, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, the level of insecurity is a bit lower, so would hover around 19%. So that is quite good, but at the same time, 19% is still about 1 in 5 people in severely insecure work. So that is still quite a substantial number of people. Then when we compare that to a place like Tees Valley, we see that 24% of workers in Tees Valley are in insecure work. So that is nearly 1 in 4 workers compared with 1 in 5 nationally. I mean, so there are some of these differences that we're seeing between the combined authorities, but there's also actually larger differences within the combined authorities. So we're using 2 examples here that you can also find in those city region employment profiles. We're looking here at the West Midlands and then at Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. So you can see on this map by the differences in colour, as well as in that first column in the table, that there's quite a range of difference in the experience of insecure work. So, for example, in Dudley, that's highlighted in green, maybe around 1 in 6 people experience insecure work, but that goes up to about actually over 1 in 4 people in Wolverhampton. So quite a big difference there within the West Midlands. A very similar picture here for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, where you see Fenland and the city of Cambridge that have quite low levels of insecure work, but then Peterborough, more than 1 in 4 people are in severely insecure work, so quite substantial. We know kind of what the drivers are for this. So we know that it's kind of the sectoral mix and the kinds of jobs that are available in an area that drive those levels of insecurity that we're seeing. We know from some of our previous work that insecurity tends to be concentrated in specific sectors. So particularly in hospitality and distribution, services, agriculture, retail, and health and social care. But the interesting thing was that when we looked deeper into very specifically hospitality, so just hotels and restaurants, we could see that there were still quite strong differences in outcomes for people across the country. So on average across England, about half of hospitality workers are in severely insecure work. There's quite a large incidence there of 0 hours contracts, temporary work, etc. But then we see places like Liverpool, Greater London have slightly lower than average levels of insecurity in that sector. But in West Midlands and Tees Valley, that is substantially and significantly higher than that average. And the way we're looking at that is that in a place like Liverpool, you have a visitor economy and a hospitality sector that is basically all year round. It caters to a lot of corporate events, really large cultural events, and so its activities are quite sort of high value added. Whereas in, for example, Tees Valley, the visitor economy and hospitality economy is a lot more seasonal in nature, and it tends to cater to particularly day trips. So it has lower value added activities. So that might mean that where we see higher value added activities in specific sectors, that might mean that employers or businesses have more capacity to offer secure jobs. We're seeing a relatively similar picture here across jobs, across different jobs. So basically in the places where you would see higher levels of specific sectors that tend to be quite insecure, you might see higher levels overall of insecure work. And the same thing with jobs. So we know that routine jobs and semi-routine jobs, so those are more manual jobs like hairdressers, waiters, cashiers, etc. Insecurity tends to be concentrated within those roles, sort of opposed to professional or managerial roles. But even there, we're seeing big differences across the country. So in South Yorkshire and Liverpool, lower than average rates of insecurity in routine jobs, but much higher than average rates in West of England, North of Tyne, and Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And again, we think that is related to the kinds of value added of the activities that are being conducted in the businesses and in the sectors that these jobs are housed in. Now, there are, a report made some recommendations to both government and mayoral combined authorities on what could be done to lower the rate of insecure work across the country. So let's start with the recommendations that we made to government. Of course, the long-awaited employment bill has been indefinitely delayed, but this remains a really important vehicle for us to put like job quality and security really central within labour market regulation. So this is something that we will continue to call for. But in addition to sort of suggesting that we might need some update to some of the rules and regulations that we've got around the labour market, it is also absolutely key that we enforce existing rights and protections and ensure that particularly insecure workers have recourse to redress. Then there is something that we have called for a number of times, and that is statutory sick pay. So government has responded to the consultation by saying that for them now is not the time to reform sick pay, but it is absolutely essential that we do reform this. And we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic how important it was that people had access to this. And that remains the case, particularly because a lot of insecure workers are missing out. So our proposals around that would be to reduce the waiting time for statutory sick pay, to remove the earnings threshold, to sort of widen access to statutory sick pay. Raising the rate is really important because the rate of SSP currently is very low in the international context. But then also self-employed workers don't get sick pay. So we need to put some sort of insurance in place for these workers so that they are also protected when they can't work due to ill health. We've seen a really positive development around this bill, the right to request predictable working arrangements, but that bill doesn't go far enough. It suffers from the same things that other right to request instruments have, which is that it can be refused. A right to request is not a right to have it. People may not want to request it when they know it will not be granted, etc. Plus there is a waiting period involved. So this could be reformed by, for example, reducing the waiting period from 26 weeks down to day one in the job. But there might be a call there to shift the onus towards employers. So, for example, to give people just a right to guaranteed hours, a right to predictable working arrangements, unless they request otherwise. That could be a right to request irregular hours. For mayoral combined authorities, we've seen that some of those combined authorities have made tackling insecure work a very explicit priority in some of their strategies. Even though that might not be feasible or even wanted for all of the combined authorities, this is very important to tackle really explicitly as an aim. The mayoral combined authorities have a really good in-depth view of their local situations, and currently enforcement is national. It's not devolved. It's not looking like it will be devolved. So it's really important for those mayoral combined authorities to work together with national enforcement bodies and really map the high-risk sectors, at-risk organizations, and to raise awareness of employment rights and protections among both employers and workers. We've also seen quite an increase in recent years in employment charters. So that has been a very positive development. Areas actively working on improving the quality and conditions of work in their local areas. Again, that might not be feasible for all combined authorities or all regions, but there's very important lessons in there around employer engagement and incentivizing employers to provide better working conditions that could be really helpful across the board. The mayoral combined authorities also have very important policy levers that they could use around procurement and investment that could be used as well to incentivize employers to improve working conditions. And finally, we've seen some great examples across the mayoral combined authorities around skill strategies. So particularly providing tailored skills training to move insecure workers into secure jobs, or to basically interrupt some of that harmful cycling in between worklessness and insecure work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's really helpful in terms of setting the context of our analysis. I'd now like to invite Andrea Barry from the Youth Futures Foundation to offer her reflections on both the analysis that you've just heard from Rebecca, but also the kind of the broader labour market context for young people. Given, Andrea, we know that many young people's first experience of work is very often in more precarious employment settings. So I'll hand over to you now for your reflections.
Thank you. And I just have to say again, the report, I think was really, it was really good, but also quite frankly, really stark, because here at Youth Futures Foundation, we recognize that young people are just significantly more likely to be in insecure work. And there's a narrative sometimes that, you know, when you're young, you sometimes do those jobs and it's part of the normal cycle of being in employment. But we would argue it has significant scarring effects, and not all young people experience insecure work. I mean, overall, 46% of young people aged 16 to 19 and over 27% of young people from 2024 are in insecure work, which is pretty stark for under 20. And they also have to deal with something where they are more likely to be linked to insecure work due to pay. It's like they're usually on the bottom end of the pay scale. And part of that is because they face a different minimum wage than workers over the age of 23. So when you're the age 18, you're paid just over, I think it's about £7.40, compared to workers over the age of 23 are closer to £11 as their minimum wage. So even when they start work, they automatically start on the lower end of pay, and which means they're actually more susceptible to insecure work. And there's, you know, young people can still be responsible for their own bills on their own. They can also be responsible for being the head of household. And we know that there is a relatively good amount of young people who are their head of household. So they are responsible for all of their own bills. They do not have additional family support, and they cannot easily just go move back home with mom and dad if they need to, if their costs increase and their job is still not giving them enough hours every day. And a good 29% of workers on a 0-hour contract report having no paid holiday entitlement. And the under 25 are more likely to have 0 holiday entitlement and no pay slip. And 11% are on 0-hour contracts. So I think it's, sorry, just to say, it's the only group without that have a 0-hour contract rate over the age of over 10%. And just a few other things. I think if you're in an area, or if you are in, or if you're more likely to be in insecure work, unfortunately, actually means you have a higher risk of being in NEET, so not in employment, education, or training. So that cycle of in and out of work when you're on that that end of the labor market means you're just more susceptible to being out of work and out of education. And it's also linked because younger workers who are in insecure work are also more likely to have lower qualifications or no qualification, but they're also more likely to experience mental health problems. And we have found that 29 young people in insecure work are 29% more likely to experience mental health problems than those in permanent work. So I think the urgency to do something is quite clear, because we're seeing the impact poor mental health is having on young people who are in COVID, but then also in COVID and in insecure work. And just also to say, just lastly, that the cost of living crisis, I think, for us, for Youth Futures Foundation, has really made this even more urgent, because young people have been dealing with high food prices for a long time, even before the Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and so energy prices went up, and they've been dealing with high housing costs while also being in insecure work, and having a lower wage overall, and having a less entitlement to the welfare system, so the benefit system. So they are kind of at that lower end of support, but then also pay, hours, etc. And sometimes there's that narrative again that this is okay and this is normal, but for us, this is not normal at all. So I think for Youth Future Foundation, it's a really good report. We're really excited to see this being put out there, and we are really keen to see an employment bill, especially since young people are just so much more likely to experience insecure work. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. That's really helpful, and there's certainly many points in there that we'll get into a bit further, I think, when we get into the discussion itself. But for now, Paul, I'd like to get your reflections. Paul Sunny from the Centre for Cities. It was really important for us, I think, to get the kind of perspectives of someone like Paul and an organisation like the Centre for Cities, who have spent many years analysing the performance of UK cities and city regions. So, Paul, it'd be great to get your reflections on how you see this interaction between place, job quality, and outcomes playing out across the country.
Certainly, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. I think there's one part of the report which we can explain, and it's interesting to see, and then there's one part which actually is much more puzzling. It'd be great to see more work on it. So let me start with the one which that we can explain, and that is the general level of insecure work that we see and the variance that we see across the country. I think a lot of the patterns that we see there is down to the ability of different places and the attractiveness of different places to attract in high-skilled work. So when we see places like Cambridge, especially within the Cambridge and Peterborough area, or London, for example, the levels of insecure work being a little bit lower because being able to attract in those high-paid jobs at the other end of the labour market, that then necessarily shrinks the amount of the share of insecure work that exists because of being able to attract in these high-paid jobs. And so that's clearly one of the big drivers that we need to try and tackle for these places, is how do you then try and reduce the barriers to attracting these higher paid jobs in other parts of the country where they don't exist, reducing the share of this insecure work that is present. Indeed, that is what the Levelling Up White Paper was set out to do. Hasn't made a great deal of progress since, but that is what is the heart and what it's trying to achieve. And that is ultimately what the Mayoral strategy should be trying to do too. The other, which I think is a surprise within that, is even within that more levels of insecure work, or in more insecure industries, that you still see that variation across the combined authorities. I think that one is much more of a conundrum in terms of why that happens. So there is a broader strategy that can be taken in terms of attracting in those higher paid jobs. But what you do within those sectors, I think, is a very interesting one. Why we see that geography, I haven't got any good answers to that. It'd be great to have a chat about that. But clearly there's some very interesting policy recommendations that are set out about what mayors can do to try and reduce that. And certainly I think having that baseline compared to other combined authorities is very, very helpful, because then it allows mayors to actually say, well, we are above the average or below the average, and it gives a real sense of comparability to understand where it is that they need to go. So very useful addition to the debate, and look forward to further discussion.
Thanks, Paul. That's great. And just finally then, I'm going to invite Fiona Aldridge from the West Midlands Combined Authority to give her thoughts on the report. And of course, Fiona, you're trying to grapple and address these kinds of issues firsthand every day. So it'd be great to get your sense of the analysis and what this picture looks like within the West Midlands.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'd like to echo, first of all, what Andrea said, that this is a really good report, but at the same time, it's really awful as well. That actually within the West Midlands, we are really focused on delivering inclusive economic growth for all our residents. And this report clearly shows that we have a long way to go, and we really need to focus on ensuring that people are not just at work, and we have some challenges around unemployment and inactivity, but when they are employed, and most adults in the region are, that they are employed in good, well-paid work that will enable them to thrive. And that's a key ambition for us. So it's not been easy reading. Insecure work in the West Midlands Combined Authority area is 21%. So that's above that national average, and certainly not a league table that we would want to be at the top of. I suppose for us, a lot of the focus that we've had on good work has been around our employment and skills levers. So we have devolved skills funding through the devolution deal that we recently secured. We've got some co-commissioning responsibilities around employment support. We've got some responsibilities around careers, but and there is absolutely more that we can do and should do in this space. But one of the things that really struck me from the report, and also from the different geographies within our combined authority area where we've got a particular issue, is that as much as we need to double down on our support for individuals, we also really need to focus on the quality of work available for people to move into. I know we're going to come on to it later, but tomorrow's autumn statement is expected to have a whole set of back to work measures, and that will include support for individuals. But if we don't improve the quality of work that is available, then it can often be a very rational choice for people not to step into employment or not to progress into employment. So I think a real challenge there for us. We know as a region that our pay is lower than the UK average, and that has been something we've been really focused on. So how do we support those people in low paid work to progress through our skills offer, through support around in-work progression? And what this report helpfully does is say, yes, low pay is an issue, but it's not the whole issue, and there are some broader things to do around broader quality of work. Now, as mayors, and I absolutely agree with Paul that mayors have a key responsibility here, and there are various funding parts and there are various levers that we can deploy. There are many things as well where we don't have those levers, and it's useful to have recommendations for national government as well as for regional government. But I'm really conscious that apart from our direct impact, that mayors can be really powerful as well in their leadership and convening roles. So thinking about what we can do in our procurement, what we can do by working with employers within our regions, what we can do to tie employment and good quality employment to our business support as well as our skills provision are all things that we're going to do. Really well-timed reports from the Work Foundation for us. We're currently expanding our skills strategy into an employment and skills strategy. So we're definitely keen to take on these recommendations and happy to answer questions and join in the discussion later.
Brilliant, thank you, Fiona. If I can ask all of our panelists now to turn their cameras back on, we will open out that conversation. Really, really helpful contributions from everyone. Very, very grateful for you to for joining us this afternoon. And just a reminder to everybody who is watching, if you do want to ask a question of anybody on the panel today, please do use the Q&A function. To get the conversation moving, Paul, I thought I might turn to you first to sort of set perhaps some of the bigger picture scene here for some of our combined authorities across England. Now, many years ago, you did a study at the Centre for Cities, didn't you? You led a study looking at the last 100 years of changing urban economic performance across the country and trying to kind of understand why we see different patterns of economic activity. And I just wondered what role you thought some of that economic legacy through the 20th century into the 21st century might actually be influencing the picture that we see today when it comes to insecure and low quality work.
I love that report, Ben. I'm really glad that you've highlighted it. So as you said, we looked at 100 years of change, went back to the 1911 census, and then tried to see what were the patterns of performance back in 1911, and how that then traced through to how places performed today. And one of the key things that we saw was that there was two routes that places had gone through over that time. They'd either reinvented their economies, so they sort of seen job losses in certain areas of the economy, and then seen sort of the frontier of the economy grow in their area, or they'd done a separate route, which was replicated their economy. So they'd lost one set of low-skilled jobs, but then replaced them for another set of low-skilled jobs. So it's like swapping coal mines for call centres, for example, and dockyards and distribution centres. And it certainly is those places that have been on that pattern for a long time, these cycles of low-skilled work, which are the ones where I would expect to see a greater amount of insecure work in place today. And the key challenge there, the key reason why we see this is because of the benefits that different places offer to businesses in terms of attracting an investment. So you think about places further south in particular, they offer access, offer access to lots of high-skilled workers and access to a network of other high-skilled businesses too. And high-skilled businesses come in and invest there despite the cost of doing so, because they'll pay a premium to get access to those types of locations. But further north, the benefits that places further north offer, because they do attract in business investment, we see lots of jobs there, is that they offer access to lots of cheap land and access to a cheaper workforce. Now, clearly that then attracts in a certain type of business, which tends to bring in with it a higher degree of insecure work. And the key thing for combined authorities across the country is about trying to sort of break the cycle, whether in that cycle of constantly not reinventing their economy, but seeing the same thing over and over again. It's trying to break that to try to attract in these higher paid industries, and with it to bring higher paid jobs, but also more secure jobs too. And so any focus that government policy has, and something might come out in the autumn statement tomorrow or not, is we now apply something called the Nissan test. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that if we think about Nissan, located in Sunderland, everybody knows that well. Nissan has done something quite interesting in that, yes, it's located in Sunderland and has over 7,000 jobs there, but they tend to be lower skilled jobs. Look at the higher skilled element of what Nissan does, it puts them further south. The engineering goes into Cranfield and the design goes into Paddington in London. Now, Nissan has done that split because of the benefits that Cranfield and London offers relative to what Sunderland offers. And so the Nissan test then is that if a policy is going to come into place, think about free ports or think about investment zones, would it change Nissan's mind? Would it mean that Nissan would actually put the high-skilled stuff in Sunderland as well as the low-skilled stuff? And if the answer to that is no, then the policy is not going to achieve what it is that we're trying to set out. And that applies in terms of number of high-skilled jobs and the way that apply in terms of the share of insecure work as well.
That's really interesting, Paul. Andrea, from your perspective, just to bring you in on this, on some of the things Paul's just been reflecting on there, because you mentioned in your comments about potential scarring effects for young people of being in more insecure jobs. And I suppose in both the quantitative and qualitative work we've done, we clearly see that the longer you spend in these kinds of jobs, the worse and more pernicious some of the impacts can be on an individual. And I suppose if Paul's right in his analysis there around essentially local economies replicating low value add, low quality job kinds of activities in their space, then what you end up getting is young people being essentially stuck or faced with the dilemma of having to kind of move somewhere else if they're able to, in order to secure more or better paid and more secure employment.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because I think there's a couple of things I was thinking about this. Is we do know that young people from an ethnic minority background are actually really more likely to be in insecure work, but they're also more likely to live in cities with really good local economies as well. So there's something else going on within a local economy for certain groups, because they're just so much more likely to leave further education, and not find a really good job. So we have a Connected Futures area in Brent, and they're really looking at that, where we are funding, with the Connected Futures Fund, we're funding partnerships in each area to look at why young people are unable to enter employment or enter sustainable employment. And some of them are actually looking at employers in some of the areas and saying, why are you less likely to actually to employ young people with good skills? And Brent is one of those areas that is looking at that as a question. But then we have Hull and Blackpool, and their question is, why are certain young people unable to find work? And Hull has an apprenticeship. They have a lot of apprenticeships in Hull, but their young people are not entering those for some reason. And for them, it has some of this related to skills and also just access to the employers. The employers do not think necessarily that some of these young people can do the job. And I think that was just the one thing to mention, that there's so many different things going on within a local economy as well. And I think specifically for young people and the scarring effect, one thing that we have noticed is that if there's falling unemployment benefits relative to average income, average wage, what is your incentive, one, to come off unemployment if you're a young person and you're already earning well under the minimum wage, but then also if your other options are other insecure work, there's no reason for you to move. You're still going to stay in insecure work. So I think that's to Paul's point, that if your local economy is just prevalent, low paid insecure work, for some of these young people, there's no option. They continually stay in insecure work. And for some of these young people, they don't want to move. And I get it. You shouldn't have to move. I mean, forgive my accent. I clearly moved, but you shouldn't have to move. And you don't necessarily want to move to go and to find really good work. But they rightly say to us, we work with our Future Voices group, they rightly say, I want to stay where I grew up. And my parents were able to stay where they grew up. So I would like to stay where I grew up. So, and some of them simply can't afford to move because it's really expensive to move to London. It's really expensive to move to Manchester, especially with higher housing costs. So I think it's a conundrum for some of these young people that it is this idea of they're stuck and there's no other options for good work. And we were hopeful during COVID that even post-COVID there would be more online jobs, more remote work, so that some of these young people with good skills could get remote work. But we are already seeing a return to the in-person workplace for some of these young people in there, who they work for. So
that's really helpful, Andrea. And I want to come back to a couple of points that you mentioned there around mobility, in particular, and potentially around skills as well later in the conversation. But Fiona, just to come to you, and given your role within the West Midlands, is Paul's sort of reflections there about economic legacy something which you sort of recognise in a sort of regional sense? And obviously, as part of your opening reflections, you were talking about sort of almost connecting the skills work to employment and broader economic strategy as well, which must be an important part of tackling some of the challenges that both Paul and Andrea have discussed so far.
Yeah, so I absolutely recognise what Paul has said, and that's why as a region we're doing quite a lot of work to develop and implement a sort of medium-term economic strategy that is focused on 8 cluster areas where we think there's most potential for economic growth and employment growth, but importantly they're kind of high value added, where we feel that we've got some regional strengths. Really important to think about where your economy has been, rather than just everybody deciding they want to be, you know, the best in a particular sector. And there's clearly in the middle of the country some things that we are never going to be strong at in the West Midlands. But, you know, we've had a historical base around automotive, and so we're developing our economy around EVs, for example. And so thinking about what the realistic transition is there, very much wanting to attract high value jobs to the region. And our challenge therefore is, how do we ensure that our residents have the high level of skills and qualifications needed to meet those jobs? And at the minute we have a lower than average qualifications profile, and we are very much focused on ensuring that our workforce is more highly skilled. You know, 80% of the 2035 workforce has already left school. So while there are things that need to happen in your initial education, actually thinking about how we upskill, reskill, retrain adults is really important. But adults are only going to engage in learning and training if they can see that sort of more immediate benefit. They've got a whole host of other things going on. And so what we've really been able to do through our devolved skills funding is tie the training that we offer to good employment opportunities within the region, because people can see the jobs and see a pathway to them for someone like them, then they're more likely to engage. And we've had some success, but as you'll see from the figures published, we've got a long way to go, but very focused on achieving that goal.
Fantastic. And actually, Fiona, while you have the floor, we do have a question from a participant, which is essentially asking around the role of short-term contracts in public sector organisations, and the extent to which that is causing a kind of sense of insecurity for many public sector jobs. I'm not expecting you to be able to comment on that across the board of the public sector, but I just wonder whether that is something which within the West Midlands you are sort of engaging with partners around, in terms of the quality of employment provision within the public sector within the West Midlands.
Yeah, I mean, the public sector is a major employer within the region, and it is a major spender within the region. And as much as we need to think about and play a leadership role in every part of the economy. There are more immediate things we can do with who we employ, how we employ them, and what we do through our contracts. That's true for us in our skills provision. So we invest about £170 million a year. That needs to be with good employers and with people that can connect to good jobs. And actually, I work with local authorities, I work with NHS, and our work ourselves as employer all has to reflect that. We can't expect other people to do what we are not doing. There is more to do, absolutely, and there's some really difficult challenges about local authority financing at the moment, but we have to, it is short term to pass that on to our residents and our workers, who are then less able to thrive. And what you see really clearly in a combined authority area is if you don't deal with an issue from one particular perspective, you deal with it from another. So if people are in poor quality work, you see that in your health figures, or you see that in your homelessness figures, or you see it in other figures. And so there is a way in which, at a place-based level, whether that's combined authority or not, if things feel more holistic, you've got more levers to do something about, although, you know, arguably still relatively few. But the focus on prevention, on good quality from the outset, becomes even more important.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I will definitely come back to you later to ask about the future of devolution and other levers which city regions might benefit from. But in the meantime, Paul, we've had another question, which I think is directly back to you, really, around, are there examples of other policies that have undergone the Nissan test and have passed?
That is a good question. The short answer to that probably is no. Actually, we can probably expand a little bit on that. I think if you look at what's happened in Birmingham and Manchester in the 1990s, I think they both independently took on a suite of policies which were designed to improve the performance of their city centres. So in Birmingham, you had the Highbury Initiative in the late 80s, which kicked off all of the work that's happened in Birmingham city centre. And in the early 90s, Manchester came together and created a development corporation and had a real sort of focus on Manchester city centre, even before the IRA bomb went off in 96, which is usually what people point as to be the turning point for Manchester city centre. And the result of that now is that their city centres have grown at quite some incredible rates. You know, and their city centre economy performed very well as a result. So lots of jobs there, lots of high-paid jobs there in particular. And we've seen this in those places as well as other places in recent decades, these high-skilled, high-paid jobs, you know, locating within city centre locations. I think the issue for a place like a Manchester or Birmingham is that while it's seen a success in its city centre, their city centres still don't play a very large role in their wider city region economies. And that means that, yes, there are more high-paid jobs, but certainly not enough high-paid jobs to be spreading the prosperity as much as we want to. So I think that focus on the city centres, the consistent approach to that over a number of decades in terms of trying to make those places more attractive places to do business. I think there's a lot to learn from that for other places, which, you know, is very different to enterprise zones, investment zones, free ports, which are the types of policies that we've seen at a national level, not only just in the last 10 years, but actually in the last 30 or 40 years.
Fantastic, thank you, Paul. I'm going to move the conversation on now because I'm conscious we've only got 15 minutes left of the discussion. I want to get into a little bit more about some of the kind of practical policy things that we might look to do in order to try and shift some of the patterns that we see across the country. And in particular, I want to kind of address two areas, one of which is, well, both of which in a way have already come up through the conversation, but in a bit more detail. And one is around skills in particular. And we can talk a little bit about the kind of skills provision and how that works. But to begin with, Andrea, I just thought I'd come to you and get your reflections on whether you feel that young people have and particularly some of the young people who are perhaps from the most deprived parts of the country, really have the confidence that engaging in the skills system is actually going to get them to where they might want to be in terms of employment outcomes, and what we might do about that if there is a gap there in terms of, you know, really believing that if they do study or if they do get into an apprenticeship, that actually it's going to lead to a sustained, well-paid employment opportunity.
Thanks, and I'm really happy you brought up apprenticeships because we've seen for some time that, especially even before COVID, that young people that there was a decline in apprenticeship starts, and also certain groups are just so much more likely to leave an apprenticeship without finishing. So I do what we're doing some work on apprenticeships actually currently, where we're talking to young people and we're looking at certain groups, like there's ethnic minority groups where they're just significantly more likely to do an apprenticeship over the age of 25 rather than under the age of 25. So there must be something there where there's this expectation that apprenticeship for certain young people, and I think there is a bit of branding or framing around the idea that apprenticeships are for young people who are unable to go to university or are in an area where there's not a lot of really high paid jobs that you can get from university, and it means that certain young people are more likely to go in them than not. And that's something we're really exploring. But I do think there is, when we speak to young people, especially from marginalized groups who are from the care system, they are from an ethnic minority group, or they've had mental health struggles, or they have a disability, they feel that there's a significant disconnect with what they learn and what they study and how their ability to find a really good job. And when we've run 2 surveys specifically to young people from an ethnic minority background, and the one thing we ask them for is, what are you most looking for? And they say a good job. All they want is a good job, and all they want is to study something that helps them get a good job, that is something that fulfills them. So they really just want a good, it's really basic, I think, what young people want. It's something that we all want. And we also asked them, what would you like the government to do? And one thing that they did mention often is the ability to have guaranteed employment support and guaranteed work experience, because some of the young people, they say that when they go through university or they go through some type of training opportunity, the first thing they're asked is, do you have any work experience in this? And of course they don't, they're 19. They're 19 years old and this is their first real job in the sector. And if they've been in insecure work for a long time and they're trying to train into something else, I think they would need to see the ability that this will lead to something. I think it's really hard to do that when your local economy doesn't have those jobs. They don't have those jobs at all. So again, it gets back to my point that I think there is something we can do from the government side about helping young people make that transition through. But then again, there has to be something on the local economy side that creates the jobs in the areas where young people want to live. And not every young person wants to live in London.
Yeah. Fiona, it'd be great to get your reflections on how we essentially drive improvements in the skills system, I suppose, which I know is the work which you're engaged in. And obviously the West Midlands devolution deal has had some certainly relatively exciting elements sort of brought into it around skills. And I suppose if Andrea's just been speaking there to some of the concerns around engaging young people in the skills system, we know, of course, there are other demographic groups who are more likely to be in insecure work, as Rebecca was referring to earlier, but who may also feel quite distant from the skills system, or may find that in their engagement with the welfare system that there are clashes there between what they need to do in order to receive universal credit versus being able to attend training and skills. So your sense of how we can kind of stitch this together better and the work that you're doing regionally to connect with some of those communities.
Yeah, so we're trying to create an integrated employment and skills system for the region. The idea that you would separate them out is just mad, really. So of course people get involved with learning for other reasons than to get a good job, but actually, as Andrea says, lots of people just want a good job, and that's a really good ambition to have, isn't it? Since we had devolved skills funding in 2019, we've therefore really focused on understanding our labour market, understanding our employment opportunities, and as kind of future opportunities as well as current ones where we want the economy to go as well as where it is, and then to make sure that we are buying really good skills provision that helps people get from where they are to good jobs within the region. Now that is so much more than buying qualifications, and the national system bought qualifications. We've moved to thinking about what are the programs of learning and support that will help you get a job, and that often is about work experience. It's about mentoring and coaching. It's around helping with some of the costs. It's, if you're doing something on construction, it's about getting licensed to work on a site. So those overall programs really help. And we still have massive inequalities in who accesses learning and training, but what we are finding is that with a focus on outcomes and support for people into good jobs, really strong connections with employers, actually we are helping more people get into jobs. So our skills provision looks quite different now. So it's much more focused on regional economic priorities. It is, of course, focused on making sure that people have the basics and the foundations, but then giving them a really clear pathway to good jobs that are appearing in the region. And some of that's a skills provision. Careers is also really critical. People need to know what the jobs are and how to get to them and what they need. So we're seeking to wrap this together. You mentioned employment support. We work really closely with DWP in our region, and we're always trying to be able to connect to those things. I don't think it helps that they're very separate nationally, and we're often working despite the system. We're hoping that this DEBO deal will help us get a bit closer to having an integrated offer. But where benefits pull you away, that makes it harder. And if the pressure is to get into a first job, any job, then that can really detract from the ability to get people into a good job, a better job, a more secure job, a better paid job. And there's some natural tensions there, which we'll do what we can locally, but it is always good to think about what the national framework is as well that will make that a success.
Absolutely. We've heard directly from people in that situation who found themselves having to forego training courses and skills development in order to fulfill their job search requirements, which is clearly not really the overall aim here, even from the government themselves. Rebecca, I wanted to come to you because I'm conscious that through the course of this conversation, we've sort of slipped into really and a kind of an equivalence between low-skilled work and insecure work. And I just think it's probably worth challenging that a little bit, isn't it? That low-skilled work shouldn't necessarily be insecure work, should it?
Absolutely. And this is something that we hear quite a bit sort of in the broader landscape around this. Definitely. I mean, there are a lot of jobs like semi-routine and routine jobs that I talked about earlier in which insecurity tends to be concentrated. They're often equated with low-skilled jobs, and they are not. Being a hairdresser requires real expertise, real skill. I've cut some hair during the COVID-19 pandemic. I can absolutely confirm this. But also insecurity, we find that across the board. We also find that in some professional managerial jobs, etc., mostly among people who experience other forms of labour market disadvantage, like women, like disabled workers, etc. So yes, we'd not like to equate insecure work with bad work necessarily, or with low-skilled work.
Absolutely. And I think what I would add to that as well is, in a sense, it is also reflective of a choice of how we regulate the labour market. And I suppose that's the other area, given others have mentioned around an employment bill and the importance of driving up employment standards, that I wanted to cover off in this part of the discussion. And Paul, I wonder if I bring you in, because one of our recommendations in the report and across a number of Work Foundation outputs is around strengthening employment regulations to try and get rid of some of or curb some of the more pernicious elements of one-sided flexibility. Would you have concerns about what the impact of some of those changes could be on some of our more struggling city region economies? And what would you say about how we might square some of that?
Well, certainly there's a question about what impact it has. And businesses, particularly if we are talking about low skilled insecure work, noting the point that you've just made there, Rebecca, very well. But in terms of that low skilled insecure work, businesses have a choice between employing a person or actually going and employing a machine to do that work instead. And so there's a question of, well, if we then strengthen the rights there, does that then mean that we then employ fewer people? That sort of message concern was something that was in place around when the national minimum wage was brought in, and that's something that doesn't seem to have happened. But it is something we need to be aware of, that we do exist in a world of trade-offs, and by changing this thing, does it then have unintended consequences? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but I think it probably means you need to have a secondary strategy, which then goes back to what you said around skills, Ben, which is, if that is going to happen, what are we going to do to try and deal with that? And I think ultimately, with these types of interventions are hopefully short term, and there's a longer term intervention, which is how do we try and give people the skills that they need, so they're not then working in particularly low skilled insecure work, but actually got the skills to go on to take on a job which is potentially more secure. And so I sort of see that recommendation as being more of a short term intervention, and sort of alongside that longer term element, which is ultimately what we want to achieve in terms of boosting the number of these more secure jobs in city regions across the country.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, definitely not mutually exclusive policy ambitions. While you have the floor, Paul, I'm keen to move us on as well to whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic around the kinds of jobs we might see created in the future. And I suppose particularly in those places where we do see concentrations of insecure work at the moment. Given trends around net zero or AI and automation, what's your sense of whether the kinds of jobs that we're likely to see created in the future are more or less likely to offer the kinds of security that ideally we would like to see them offer?
Crystal ball time. I hope I'm not going to be helping this in 20 years' time. Well, the way that I think generally we're optimistic. And the reason for that is because if you look back, and we've done some work on this in the past, to the types of jobs that have been lost and created over the last century, you see that innovations have destroyed a lot of jobs. So, we go to a cash machine now rather than going and getting a teller to count our cash out. For example, we switch along streetlights through however councils do it, but once upon a time it was someone going through with a gas light and literally lighting up all of the street lamps. And yet, despite the destruction of those jobs, we've got many more jobs now than what we did in the past, because when these jobs get destroyed, there are jobs that are created in other areas as the economy develops. I would be hopeful that the developments that we see in the coming decades will follow that trend. But yes, there will be certain jobs that will be destroyed or automated. Should I say destroyed sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? Automated, but there'll be other jobs that will be created that we just can't even fathom what they will be as yet. I think the challenge, though, from a geography perspective, is how well will places that traditionally have struggled, that have replicated their economy, be positioned to attract in these new jobs? And when you look at where the new economy jobs are today, those cutting edge jobs that we think are going to drive growth tomorrow, they tend to be in places that have traditionally had stronger economies rather than weaker economies. And that all comes back to the relative benefits that they offer business. If these places are offering access to lots of high-skilled workers and a network of other high-skilled businesses, they're much better placed to be attracting in these high-skilled jobs than places that are offering access to low-cost land and a pool of lower-skilled workers. And it's that element, the skilled element in particular, that needs to change if these places are going to go from continuing to replicate their economies to actually reinventing their economies.
Thanks, Paul. That's really helpful and enough crystal ball gazing, I think, to adequately answer the question. We've only got a few minutes left, and speaking of looking into a crystal ball, we don't have to look so far into the future for the autumn statement, which of course is happening tomorrow. And so I just wanted to round off the conversation really with getting reflections from Paul, Fiona, and Andrea around what they're hoping to see in the autumn statement tomorrow that might make some positive progress on the kinds of issues that we've been talking about today. So probably about between 30 and 60 seconds from each of you, if that's okay, to try and get to a prompt finish at 3 o'clock. But Fiona, I'll come to you first, if that's all right, from a West Midlands perspective.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we are expecting to see is further details around our devolution deal, because actually if we can pull together a set of levers that can really make the West Midlands more attractive for businesses to invest, then that enables us to kind of take a bit more control of our own destiny. And that is something that we think we can do well, but feel quite constrained in. There's some trailed kind of news, trailed news and everything, isn't there, about investment. And I think Paul's Nissan test is really interesting there. So if we are seeing government invest in particular sectors, then where in the country are we seeing this? Are we still committed to levelling up and addressing inequalities, or has the agenda changed? And then, as I mentioned earlier, there has been a whole set of releases and trails around the back to work agenda. And of course, we want to make sure that people are supported as well as possible into jobs, but those must be good jobs. If we are supporting people into what is insecure work, that is actually bad for them, and the issue we'll have around work and health will be exacerbated. So I think something very holistic, long-term and focused on addressing some of those regional inequalities would be really welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fiona. Andrea, I'll come to you next. What would a good autumn statement for the country's young people look like?
Yeah, the young people are usually kind of at the end of an autumn statement or any statement. They don't get always their own section of a statement, but I think if they did, there would have to be something on the minimum wage. So earlier they announced that they were raising the living wage for anyone over the age of 23. It isn't very helpful when you're under the age of 23. So I think that's something we would be really, really keen to see some kind of movement on equalizing that so that young people can also benefit from higher wages. And I think for that, it would also have to do related to the apprenticeship wage. We're doing some analysis and some work on whether or not the apprenticeship wage actually holds young people back from accessing really good apprenticeship. And I think finally, I'm also a bit concerned about the back to work scheme for young people, because we do know that the meet rate has gone up. So the young people who are out of education, employment or training has gone up. And it means that young people who are in their the unemployment rate's gone up as well. So those young people who are out of education, who are really far away from learning and are possibly on benefits to push them into insecure work, to make sure they go to work, is frightening for young people, because some young people do suffer sometimes with confidence. They've been in COVID, they learned during COVID, they had no access to in-person support for a very long time, and you're going to push them into work when they probably lack the mental capacity at the time because they've just been stuck at home, and tell them that they're forced to do this, otherwise they have no money. And I think that can be really concerning for young people. So I think I would hope the government would recognize that not all young people look the same, and not all young people have the same support at home as well.
I think it's a really, really crucial point given the context of the last few years. Paul, I'll hand over to you for the final word on this section.
So something to boost business investment, more money for skills, and more detail around devolution with my 3 asks.
Admirably concise. Thank you very much, Paul, and to all of our contributors today. Thank you to Rebecca, who's led our analysis on insecure work more broadly over the last 3 years and in producing the analysis that you've heard about today. At the Work Foundation, we've got a busy programme of research and events through the remainder of 2023. We've got some new analysis coming out shortly looking at how we might reform 0 hours contracts while retaining the benefits of flexibility in the labour market. And you can sign up already to our next event, which is on Tuesday, the 12th of December, to coincide with the latest labour market data coming out, but with a specific focus on health and work. All of our research and events are free to access, but the best way of not missing out is by signing up to our newsletter. For now, though, thank you once again. I hope you found the discussion valuable and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.